Chapter 1 The Uroboros. The mythological stages in the evolution of consciousness begin with the stage when the ego is contained in the unconscious, and led up to in a situation in which the ego not only becomes aware of its own position and defends it heroically, but also becomes capable of broadening and relativizing its experiences through the changes affected by its own activity. The first cycle of myth is the creation myth. Here the mythological projection of psychic material appears in cosmogonic form, as the mythology of creation. The world and the unconscious predominate and form the object of myth. Ego and man are only nascent as yet, and their birth, suffering, and emancipation constitute the phases of the creation myth. At the stage of the separation of the world parents, the germ of ego consciousness finally asserts itself. While yet in the fold of the creation myth, it enters upon the second cycle, namely the hero myth, in which the ego, consciousness, and the human world become conscious of themselves and of their dignity. In the beginning is perfection, wholeness. This original perfection can only be circumscribed, or described symbolically. Its nature defies any description other than a mythological one, because that which describes the ego, and that which is described, the beginning, which is prior to any ego, prove to be incommensurable quantities as soon as the ego tries to grasp its object conceptually, as a content of consciousness. For this reason, a symbol always stands at the beginning, the most striking feature of which is its multiplicity of meanings, its indeterminate and indeterminable character. The beginning can be laid hold of in two places. It can be conceived of in the life of mankind as the earliest dawn of human history, and in the life of the individual as the earliest dawn of childhood. The self-representation of the dawn of human history can be seen from its symbolic description in ritual and myth. The earliest dawn of childhood, like that of mankind, is depicted in images which rise from the depths of the unconscious and reveal themselves to the already individualized ego. The dawn state of the beginning projects itself mythologically in cosmic form, appearing as the beginning of the world, as the mythology of creation. Mythological accounts of the beginning must invariably begin with the outside world, for world and psyche are still one. There is as yet no reflecting, self-conscious ego that could refer anything to itself, that is, reflect. Not only is the psyche open to the world, it is identical with and undifferentiated from the world. It knows itself as the world and in the world, and experiences its own becoming as a world becoming, its own images as the starry heavens, and its own contents as the world creating gods. Ernst Kaiser has shown in all peoples and all religions, creation appears as the creation of light. Thus the coming of consciousness, manifesting itself as light in contrast to the darkness of the unconscious, is the real object of creation mythology. Kaiser has likewise shown that in the different stages of mythological consciousness, the first thing to be discovered is subjective reality, the formation of the ego and individuality. The beginning of this development, mythologically regarded as the beginning of the world, is the coming of light, without which no world process could be seen at all. But the earliest dawn is still prior to this birth of light out of darkness, and a wealth of symbols surrounds it. The formation of representation peculiar to the unconscious is not that of the conscious mind. It neither attempts nor is able to seize hold of and define its objects in a series of discursive explanations, and reduce them to clarity by logical analysis. The way of the unconscious is different. Symbols gather around the thing to be explained, understood, interpreted. The act of becoming conscious consists of the concentric grouping of symbols around the object, all circumscribing and describing the unknown from many sides. Each symbol lays bare another essential side of the object to be grasped, points to another facet of meaning. Only the canon of these symbols congregating around the center in question, the coherent symbol group, can lead to an understanding of what the symbols point to and what they are trying to express. The symbolic story of the beginning, which speaks to us from the mythology of all ages, is the attempt made by man's childlike, pre-scientific consciousness to master problems and enigmas which are mostly beyond the grasp of even our modern developed consciousness. If our consciousness, with epistemological resignation, is constrained to regard the question of the beginning as unanswerable and therefore unscientific, it may be right. But the psyche, which can neither be taught nor led astray by the self-criticism of the conscious mind, always poses the question afresh as one that is essential to it. The question of the beginning is also the question of whence. It is the original and fateful question to which cosmology and the creation myths have ever tried to give new and different answers. This original question about the beginning of the world is at the same time the question about the origin of man, the origin of consciousness, and of the ego. It is the fateful question, where did I come from? That faces every human being as soon as he arrives upon the threshold of consciousness. The mythological answers to these questions are symbolical, like all answers that come from the depths of the psyche, the unconscious. The metaphorical nature of the symbol says, this is this, that is that. The statement of identity and the logic of consciousness erected upon it have no value for the psyche and the unconscious. The psyche blends, as does the dream. It spins and weaves together, combining each with each. The symbol, therefore, is an analogy, more of an equivalence than an equation. And therein lies its wealth of meanings, but also its elusiveness. Only the symbol group, compact partly of contradictory analogies, can make something unknown and beyond the grasp of consciousness, more intelligible and more capable of becoming conscious. One symbol of the original perfection is the circle. Allied to it are the sphere, the egg, the rotundum, the round of alchemy. It is Plato's round that was there in the beginning, from Plato. Therefore the demiurge made the world in the shape of a sphere, giving it that figure which of all is most perfect and the most equal to itself. Unquote. Circle, sphere, and round are all aspects of the self-contained, which is without beginning and end. In its pre-worldly perfection, it is prior to any process, eternal. For in its roundness there is no before and no after, no time. There is no above and no below, no space. All this can only come from the coming of light, of consciousness, which is not yet present. Now all is under sway of the unmanifest Godhead, whose symbol is therefore the circle. The round is the egg, the philosophical world egg, the nucleus of the beginning, and the germ of which, as humanity teaches everywhere, the world arises. It is also the perfect state in which opposites are united. The perfect beginning because the opposites have not yet flown apart and the world has not yet begun. The perfect end because in it the opposites have come together again in a synthesis, and the world is once more at rest. The container of opposites is the Chinese Tai Chi, a round containing black and white, day and night, heaven and earth, male and female. Lao Tzu says of it, quote, "There was something formless yet complete, that existed before heaven and earth, without sound, without substance, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven." Unquote. Each of these pairs of opposites forms the nucleus of a group of symbols which cannot be described here in any great detail. A few examples must suffice. The round is the calabash, containing the world parents. In Egypt as in New Zealand, in Greece as in Africa and India, the world parents, heaven and earth, lie one on top of the other in the round, spacelessly and timelessly united. For as yet nothing has come between them to create the duality out of the original unity. The container of masculine and feminine opposites is the great hermaphrodite, the primal creative element, the Hindu Purusha, who combines the poles in himself. Quote, "In the beginning this world was soul, Atman, alone in the form of a person. Looking around, he saw nothing else than himself. He said first, 'I am.' He was indeed as large as a woman and a man closely embraced. He caused that self to fall, pat, into two pieces. Therefrom arose a husband, pati, and a wife, patni." Unquote. What is said here of the deity recalls Plato's original man. There too the hermaphroditic round stands at the beginning. This perfect state of being, in which the opposites are contained, is perfect because it is autarkic. Its self-sufficiency, self-contentment, and independence of any you or any other are signs of its self-contained eternality. We read in Plato, quote, "And he established the universe a sphere revolving in a circle, one in solidarity, yet by reason of its excellence able to bear itself company, and needing no other friendship or acquaintance." Unquote. The perfection of that which rests in itself no way contradicts the perfection of that which encircles itself. Although absolute rest is something static and eternal, unchanging, and therefore without history, it is at the same time the place of origin and the germ cell of creativity. Living the cycle of its own life, it is the circular snake, the primal dragon of the beginning that bites its own tail, the self-begetting Uroboros. This ancient Egyptian symbol of which it is said, quote, "Draco interfici siepsum, maritat siepsum, impraniat siepsum." Unquote. It slays, weds, and impregnates itself. It is man and woman, begetting and conceiving, devouring and giving birth, active and passive, above and below, at once. As the heavenly serpent, the Uroboros was known in ancient Babylon. In later times, in the same area, it was often depicted by the Mandaeans. Its origin is ascribed by Macrobius to the Phoenicians. It is the archetype of the All-One, appearing as Leviathan, as Ion, as Oceanus, and also the primal being that says, "I am Alpha and Omega." As the Neph of antiquity, it is the primal snake, the most ancient deity of the prehistoric world. The Uroboros can be traced in the revelation of St. John and among the Gnostics, as well as Roman synchronists. There are pictures of it in sand paintings of Navajo Indians and in Gado. It is found in Egypt, Africa, Mexico, and India, among the gypsies as an amulet, and in the alchemical texts. The symbolic thinking portrayed in these images of the round endeavors to grasp contents which even our present-day consciousness can only understand as paradoxes, precisely because it cannot grasp them. If we give the name of all or nothing to the beginning, and speak in this connection of wholeness, unity, non-differentiation, and the absence of opposites, all these concepts, if we look at them more closely and try to conceive them, instead of just going on thinking of them, are found to be images derived and abstracted from these basic symbols. Images and symbols have this advantage over paradoxical philosophical formulations of infinite unity and unimaged wholeness, that their unity can be seen and grasped as a unity at one glance. More, all these symbols which men have sought to grasp the beginning in mythological terms are as alive today as they ever were. They have their place not only in art and religion, but in the living processes of the individual psyche, in dreams and in fantasies. And so long as man shall exist, perfection will continue to appear as the circle, the sphere, the round. and the primal deity who is sufficient unto himself, and the self who has gone beyond the opposites will reappear in the image of the round, the mandala. This round and its existence in the round, existence in the Uroboros, is the symbolic self-representation of the dawn state, showing the infancy both of mankind and of the child. The validity and reality of the Uroboros symbol rests on the collective basis. It corresponds to an evolutionary stage which can be recollected in the psyche structure of every human being. It functions as a transpersonal factor that was there as a psychic stage of being before the formation of an ego. Moreover, its reality is re-experienced in every early childhood, and the child's personal experience of this pre-ego stage retraces the old track trodden by humanity. An embryonic and still undeveloped germ of ego consciousness slumbers in the perfect round and awakens. It is immaterial whether we are dealing with a self-representation of this psychic stage, manifesting itself in a symbol, or whether a later ego describes this preliminary stage as its own past. Since the ego has and can have no experiences of its own in the embryonic state, not even psychic experiences, for its experiencing consciousness still slumbers in the germ. The later ego will describe this earlier state, of which it has indefinite but symbolically graspable knowledge, as a prenatal time. It is this time of existence in paradise, where the psyche has her pre-worldly abode, the time before the birth of the ego, the time of the unconscious envelopment, of swimming in the ocean of the unborn. The time of the beginning, before the coming of opposites, must be understood as a self-description of that great epoch when there was still no consciousness. It is the Wu Qi of Chinese philosophy, whose symbol is the empty circle. Everything is still in the now and forever of the eternal being, sun, moon, and stars. These symbols of time and therefore mortality have not yet been created, and day and night, yesterday and tomorrow, Genesis and decay, the flux of life and birth and death, have not yet entered into the world. This prehistoric state of being is not time, but eternity, just as the time before the coming of man and before the birth and begetting of its eternity. And just as there is no time before the birth of man and ego, only eternity, so there is no space, only infinity. The question of whence, which is both the original question and the question about origin, has but one answer. And of this there are two interpretations. The answer is the round, and the two interpretations, the womb and the parents. It is crucial for every psychology, and especially for every psychology of childhood, to understand this problem and its symbolism. The Uroboros appears as the round container, the maternal womb, but also as the union of masculine and feminine opposites, the world parents joined in perpetual cohabitation. Although it seems quite natural that the original question should be connected with the problem of the world parents, we must realize at once that we are dealing with symbols of origination and not with sexuality or genital theory. The problem around which mythological statements revolve, and which was from the very beginning the crucial question for man, is really concerned with the origins of life, of the spirit, and the soul. This is not to say that early man was something of a philosopher. Abstract questions of this kind were wholly alien to his consciousness. Mythology, however, is the product of the collective unconscious. And anyone acquainted with primitive psychology must stand amazed at the unconscious wisdom which rises up from the depths of the human psyche in answer to these unconscious questions. The unconscious knowledge of the background of life and of man's dealing with it is laid in ritual and myth. These are the answers of what he calls the human soul and the human mind to questions which were very much alive for him, even though no ego consciousness had consciously asked them. Many primitive peoples do not recognize the connection between sexual intercourse and birth, where, as among primitives, sexual intercourse often begins in childhood, but does not lead to the begetting of children. It is natural to conclude that the birth of children has nothing to do with the impregnation by a man in the sexual act. The question about the origin, however, must always be answered by womb, for it is the immemorable experience of mankind that every newborn creature comes from a womb. Hence, the round of mythology is also called the womb in the uterus. Though, this place of origin should not be taken concretely. In fact, all mythology says over and over again that this womb is an image, the woman's womb being only a partial aspect of the primordial symbol of the place of origination from whence we came. This primordial symbol means many things at once. It is not just one content or part of the body, but a plurality, a world or cosmic region where many contents hide and have their essential abode. The mothers are not a mother. Anything deep, abyss, valley, ground, also the sea and the bottom of the sea, foundations, lakes and pools, the earth, the underworld, the cave, the house, the city. All are parts of this archetype. Anything big and embracing which contains, surrounds, enwraps, shelters, preserves, and nourishes anything small belongs to the primordial matriarchal realm. When Freud saw that everything hollow was feminine, he would have been right if only he had grasped it as a symbol. By interpreting it as the female genitalia, he profoundly misunderstood it, because female genitalia are only a tiny part of the archetype of the primordial mother. Compared with this maternal Uroboros, human consciousness feels itself embryonic, for the ego feels fully contained in this primordial symbol. It is only a tiny helpless newcomer. In the pleromatic phase of life, when the ego swims about in the round like a tadpole, there is nothing but the Uroboros in existence. Humanity does not yet exist. There is only divinity. Only the world has being. Naturally, then, the first phases of man's evolving ego consciousness are under the dominance of the Uroboros. They are the phases of an infantile ego consciousness which, although no longer entirely embryonic and already possessing an existence of its own, still lives in the round, not yet detached from it, and only just beginning to differentiate itself from it. This initial stage, when ego conscious is still on the infantile level, is marked by the predominance of the maternal side of the Uroboros. The world is experienced as all-embracing, and in it man experiences himself as a self, sporadically and momentarily only. Just as the infantile ego, living this phase over again, feebly developed, easily tired, emerges like an island out of the ocean of the unconscious for occasional moments only, and then sinks back again. So early man experiences the world. Small, feeble, and much given to sleep, i.e., for the most part unconscious, he swims about in his instincts like an animal. Enfolded and upborne by great Mother Nature, rocked in her arms, he is delivered over to her for good or ill. Nothing is himself. Everything is the world. The world shelters and nourishes him, while he scarcely wills and acts at all, doing nothing, lying inert in the unconscious, merely being there in an inexhaustible twilit world. All needs effortlessly supplied by the great nourisher. Such is that early beatific state. All the positive maternal traits are in evidence at this stage, when the ego is still embryonic and has no activity of its own. The Uroboros of the maternal world is life and psyche in one. It gives nourishment and pleasure, protects and warms, comforts and forgives. It is the refuge for all suffering, the goal of all desire. For always the mother is she who fulfills, the best tower and helper. This living image of the great and good mother has at all times of distress been the refuge of humanity, and ever shall be. For the state of being contained in the whole, without responsibility or effort, with no doubts and no division of the world into two, is paradisal, and can never again be realized in the pristine happy-go-luckiness in adult life. The positive side of the Great Mother seems to be embodied in this stage of the Uroboros. Only at a very much higher level will the Good Mother appear again. Then, when she no longer has to do with an embryonic ego, but with an adult personality matured by rich experience of the world, she reveals herself anew as Sophia, the gracious mother, or pouring forth her riches in creative fullness of true productivity, the mother of all living. The dawn state of perfect contentment and containment was never a historical state. Rousseau was still projecting this psychic phase into the historical past as the natural state of the savage. It is rather the image of a psychic stage of humanity, just discernible as a borderline image. However much the world forced early man to face reality, it was with the greatest reluctance that he consciously entered into this reality. Even today we can see from primitives that the law of gravity, the inertia of the psyche, the desire to remain unconscious, is a fundamental human trait. Yet even this is a false formulation, since it starts from consciousness as though that were the natural and self-evident thing. But fixation in unconsciousness, the downward drag of its specific gravity, cannot be called a desire to remain unconscious. On the contrary, that is the natural thing. There is, as a counteracting force, the desire to become conscious, a veritable instinct impelling man in this direction. One has no need to desire to remain unconscious. One is primarily unconscious and can at most conquer the original situation in which man drowses in the world, drowses in the unconscious, contained in the infinite like a fish in the environing sea. The ascent towards consciousness is the unnatural thing in nature. It is specific to the species man, who on that account has justly styled himself Homo sapiens. The struggle between the specifically human and the universally natural constitutes the history of man's conscious development. So long as the infantile ego consciousness is weak and feels the strain of its own existence as heavy and oppressive, while drowsiness and sleep are felt as delicious pleasure, it has not yet discovered its own reality in differentness. So long as this continues, the Uroboros reigns as the great whirling wheel of life, where everything not yet individual is submerged in the union of opposites, passing away and willing to pass away. Man is not yet thrown back upon himself, against nature, nor the ego against the unconscious. Being oneself is still a wearisome and painful experience, still the exception that has to be overcome. It is in this sense that we speak of the Auroboric Incest. It goes without saying that the term incest is to be understood symbolically, not concretistically and sexually. Wherever the incest motif appears, it is always a prefiguration of the hieros, of the sacred marriage consummation which attains its true form only with the hero. Uroboric incest is a form of entry into the mother, of union with her, and it stands in sharp contrast to other and later forms of incest. In Urboric incest, the emphasis upon pleasure and love is in no sense active. It is more a desire to be dissolved and absorbed. Passively, one lets oneself be taken, sinks into the pleroma, melts away in the ocean of pleasure, a Liebestod. The Great Mother takes a little child back into herself, and always over Urboric incest there stands an insignia of death, signifying final dissolution in union with Mother. Cave, earth, tomb, sarcophagus, and coffin are symbols of this ritual recombination, which begins with burial in the posture of the embryo in the barrows of the Stone Age, and ends with the cinerary urns of the moderns. Many forms of nostalgia and longing signify no more than a return to the Urboric incest and self-dissolution, from the unio mystica of the saint to the drunkard's cravings for unconsciousness, and the death romanticism of Germanic races. The incest we term Uroboric is self-surrender and regression. It is the form of incest taken by the infantile ego, which is still close to the mother and has not yet come to itself. But the sick ego of the neurotic can also take this form, and so can a later exhausted ego that creeps back to the mother after having found fulfillment. Notwithstanding its own disillusion and the deadly aspect of the Uroboros, the embryonic ego does not experience Urboric incest as anything hostile, even though it is to be annihilated. The return of the great round is a happening of full passive, childlike confidence, for the infantile ego consciousness always feels its reawakening, after having been immersed in death as a rebirth. It feels protected by the maternal depths even when the ego has disappeared and there is no consciousness of itself. Man's consciousness rightly feels itself to be the child of these primordial depths, for not only in the history of mankind is consciousness a late product of the womb of the unconscious, but in every individual life, consciousness re-experiences its emergence from the unconscious in the growth of childhood. And every night in sleep, dying with the sun, it sinks back into the depths of the unconscious to be reborn in the morning and begin the day anew. The Uroboros, the great round, is not only the womb, but the world parents. The world father is joined to the world mother in Uroboric union, and they are not to be divided. They are still under the rule of the primordial law, above and below, father and mother, heaven and earth, God and world, reflect one another and cannot be put apart. How could the conjunction of opposites, as the initial state of existence, ever be represented mythologically except by the symbol of the conjoined world parents? Thus, the world parents, who are an answer to the question about origin, are themselves the universe and the prime symbol of everlasting life. They are the perfection from whence everything springs, the eternal being that begets, conceives, and brings itself to birth, that kills and revivifies. Their unity is a state of existence transcendent and divine, independent of the opposites, the inchoate ensof of the Kabbalah, which means unending plenitude and nothingness. The tremendous force of this primordial symbol of the psyche does not lie in the fact that it contains in itself the non-differentiated state of the union beyond the opposites. The Uroboros also symbolizes the creative impulse of the new beginning. It is the wheel that rolls of itself, the initial rotary movement in the upward spiral of evolution. This initial movement, the procreative thrust, naturally has an affinity with the paternal side of the Uroboros, and with the beginning of evolution in time, and is far harder to visualize than the maternal side. For instance, when we read in an Egyptian theology such passages as Atum, who indulged himself in Heliophilus, took his phallus in his hand in order to arouse pleasure, a brother and sister were produced, Shu and Tefnut, or I copulated in my hand. I joined myself to my shadow and spurted out of my own mouth. I spewed forth as Shu and spat forth as Tefnut. This clearly expresses the difficulty of grasping the creative beginnings in a symbol. What is meant would be nowadays called spontaneous generation, or the self-manifestation of a god. The original force of the images still shines through our more rather abstract terms. The Urboric mode of propagation, where begetter and conceiver are one, results in the image of immediate genesis out of semen, without partner and without duality. To call such images obscene is to be guilty of a profound misunderstanding. Actually, life in those times were far much more disciplined sexually, far purer, than in most later cultures. The sexual symbolism that appears in primitive cult and ritual has sacral and transpersonal import, as everywhere in mythology. It symbolizes the creative element, not personal genitality. It is only personalistic misunderstanding that makes these sacral contents obscene. Judaism and Christianity between them, and this includes Freud, have had a heavy and disastrous hand in this misunderstanding. The desecration of pagan values in the struggle for monotheism and for conscious ethic was necessary, and historically an advance, but it resulted in a complete distortion of the primordial world of those times. The effect of secondary personalization in the struggle against paganism was to reduce the transpersonal to the personal. Sanctity became sodomy, worship became fornication, and so on. An age whose eyes are once more open to the transpersonal must reverse this process. Later creation symbols show how these matters came to be better formulated. Not that any repression had crept in. What was to be expressed had from the very outset no sexual connotations. It was meant symbolically, but the efforts with which early man wrestled for words gives us some indication of what it was all about. The image of the self-fecundating primal god undergoes new variations in Egypt and in India, and in both cases there is a move in the direction of spiritualism. But this spiritualization is the same as the endeavor to apprehend the nature of the creative force that was there in the beginning. Quote, "It is the heart which makes all that results to come out, and it is the tongue which repeats, expresses the thought of the heart. That is what causes all the gods to be born. Atum, with his Ennead, and every divine utterance manifests itself in the thought of the heart and in the speech of the tongue." Or, "The Demiurge who created all the gods, and their cause is in his heart and in his tongue." Unquote. And finally we come to the most abstract and spiritual symbolism of all, where God is the breath of life. Quote, "He did not bring me forth from his mouth, nor conceive me in his hand, but he breathed me forth from his nostrils." Unquote. The transition from image to idea in this formulation of the creative principle becomes doubly clear when one knows that in the hieroglyphs, thought is written with the image for heart and speech with that for tongue. At this point in Egyptian mythology and its wrestlings with the problem of creation, we have the first beginnings of what was to be expressed several thousand years later as the Word of God in the Bible story of creation, and in the doctrine of the Logos, an expression that was never able to break away altogether from the primordial image of the self-manifesting and self-expressing God. Understandably enough, the creative principle that brings the world into being is derived from the creative nature of man himself. Just as a man, our figure of speech stays the same today, brings forth his creation from his own depths and expresses himself, so do the gods. In this manner, Vishnu the boar scoops the earth out of the sea, and the god ponders the world in his heart and expresses it in the creative word. The word speech is a higher product, the utterance of one sunk in himself, in his own depths. When we talk of introversion, we say the same thing. In India, tapas, inward heat and brooding, is the creative force with whose help everything is made. The self-incubating effect of introversion, a fundamental experience of the self-generating spirit, is clearly expressed in the following text. Quote, "He, Prajapati, took to praying and fasting because he desired offspring, and he made himself fruitful." Unquote. An Egyptian text says, quote, "My name was he who created himself, first god of first gods." Unquote. The same principle of heating is described in another Brahmana as the way of creation. "In the beginning this world was nothing at all. Heaven was not, nor earth, nor space. Because it was not, it bethought itself, I will be. It emitted heat." Unquote. After describing a long series of cosmogonic heatings and the production of elements, the text goes on. Quote, "He found foothold on the earth. When he thought he found a firm foothold there, he thought, I will propagate myself. He emitted heat and became pregnant." Unquote. Just as the maternal side of the Uroboros gives birth without procreation, so the paternal side procreates without the maternal womb. The two sides are complementary and belong together. The original question asks about the origin of that which moves all life. To this question, the creation myths give one answer. They say that creation is something not altogether expressible in symbols of sexuality, and they proceed to formulate the unformulable in an image. The creative word, creative breath, That is creative spirit. But this breath concept is only an abstraction from the image of the procreative, wind ruach pneuma animus, which animates through inspiration. The solar phallus symbolizing the creative element is the source of the wind, both in an Egyptian magic papyrus and in the vision of a modern psychotic. This wind, in the form of a ruach dove of the Holy Ghost, is wafted under the robe of the immaculately conceiving Virgin Mary, through a tube held out to her by God the Father and the Son. The wind is the fructifying bird known to the primitives, the ancestral spirit that blows upon the women, and also upon tortoises and female vultures, to make them fruitful. Animals as fructifiers, God as fructifiers, gods as animals, animals as gods. Everywhere the enigma of fructification is ranged alongside the creative inspiration. Mankind asks about the origin of life, and immediately life and soul fuse into one, as living psyche, power, spirit, motion, breath, and the life-giving manna. This one who stands at the beginning is the creative force contained in the Urboric unity of the world parents, from whom it blows, begets, gives birth, moves, breathes, and speaks. As the wind blows, everything grows, says the Upanishad. Although the ego experiences, and must experience, the Uroboros as the terrible dark power of the unconscious, mankind does not by any means associate this stage of its pre-conscious existence only with the feelings of dread and drowsiness. Even if for the conscious ego, light and consciousness cleave together, like darkness and unconsciousness, man still has inklings of another, and, so he thinks, a deeper extra-worldly knowledge. In mythology, this illumination is usually projected into a knowledge acquired before birth or after death. In the Bardo Thoru, the Tibetan Book of the dead man receives instruction, and the instruction culminates in the doctrine that he shall know himself identical with the great white light that shines beyond life and death. Quote, "Thine own consciousness, shining, void, and inseparable from the great body of radiance, hath no birth, nor death, and is immutable light Buddha, Amitabha." Unquote. This knowledge is post-conscious, outside and not of this world, a knowing and being in the perfection that comes after death. But it is also pre-conscious, pre-worldly, and prenatal. This is what the Jewish Midrash means when it describes knowledge to the unborn babe in the womb, saying that over its head there burns a light in which it sees all ends of the world. Also, existence in this time before the beginning is supposedly connected with foreknowledge. The creature that still exists in the round participates in the knowledge of the unformed, is merged in the ocean of wisdom. The primal ocean, likewise an origination symbol, for as a ring snake the Uroboros is also the ocean, is the source not only of creation, but of wisdom too. Hence the early cultural heroes often come up from the sea in the shape of a half-fish, like the Babylonian Oannes, and bring their wisdom as revelation to mankind. Since the original wisdom is pre-worldly, i.e., prior to the ego and the coming of consciousness, the myth says it's prenatal. But existence after death and prenatal existence in the Uroboros are the same thing. The ring of life and death is a closed circuit. It is the wheel of rebirth, and the dead man instructed in the Bardo Thoru will infallibly be born again if he fails to attain the highest knowledge in his afterlife. So for him the instruction after death is equally a prenatal one. The mythological theory of foreknowledge also explains the view that all knowing is memory. Man's task in the world is to remember with his conscious mind what was knowledge before the advent of consciousness. In this sense it is said of the Tzaddik, the perfect righteous man of Hasidism, the mystical Jewish movement dating from the end of the 18th century. Quote, "The Tzaddik finds that which has been lost since birth and restores it to men." Unquote. It is the same conception as Plato's philosophical doctrine of the prenatal vision of ideas and their remembrance. The original knowledge of one who is still enfolded in the perfect state is very evident of the psychology of the child. For this reason, many primitive peoples treat children with particular marks of respect. In the child, the great images and the archetypes of the collective unconscious are living reality, and very close to him. Indeed, many of his sayings and reactions, questions and answers, dreams and images, express this knowledge which still derives from his prenatal existence. It is transpersonal experience not personally acquired, a possession acquired from over there. Such knowledge is rightly regarded as ancestral knowledge, the child as a reborn forebear. The theory of heredity, proving that the child has the ancestral heritage biologically in himself, and to a large extent actually is this heritage, also has a psychological justification. Therefore, Jung defines the transpersonal, or the archetypes and instincts of the collective unconscious, as the deposit of ancestral experience. Hence, the child, whose life as a pre-personal entity is largely determined by the collective unconscious, actually is the living carrier of this ancestral experience. In the dawn of world consciousness, where the feebly developed ego is still under the dominance of the unconscious, there rules, besides the symbolism whose mythological stages we are trying to describe, another set of symbols which correspond to the magic body image in the psyche. Certain groups of symbols are co-oriented with certain regions of the body. Even today, the primitive body scheme of the belly, breast, and head is used in ordinary psychology, where belly is abbreviated for the instinctual world, breast and heart for the zone of feeling, and the head and brain for the zone of the spirit. Modern psychology and language have been influenced to this day by this original body scheme. The scheme is most developed in Indian psychology, in Kundalini Yoga, as the ascending consciousness rouses and activates different parts of body-soul centers. The diaphragm is supposed to correspond to the Earth's surface, and development beyond this zone is co-oriented with the rising sun, the state of consciousness that has begun to leave behind the unconscious and all ties with it. The body scheme, as the archetype of the original man in whose image the world was created, is the basic symbol in all systems where parts of the world are co-oriented with the regions of the body. This co-orientation can be seen everywhere, in Egypt as in Mexico, in Indian literature as in the Kabbalah. No God alone, but the whole world is created in man's image. The relation of the world and the gods of the body scheme is the earliest concretistic form of the anthropocentric world picture, with man standing in the middle, or at the heart of the world. It derives from one's own body sensations, which are charged with mana and are commonly misunderstood as narcissistic. The mana charge, originally associated with everything that belongs to the body, is expressed in primitive man's fear of magical influences, due to the fact that every part of the body, from hair to excrement, can stand for the body as a whole and bewitch it. Also, the symbolism of the creation myths, where everything that comes out of the body is creative, derives from the latter's mana potency. Not only the semen, but urine and spittle, sweat, dung, and breath, words and flatius, are heavy with creation. Out of it all the world comes, and the whole turnout is birth. For primitive man and the child, with his overemphasized unconscious, the main ascent falls on the visceral region and its dead weight of vegetative life. The heart for him is the highest center, representing what the thinking head means for us. For the Greeks, the midriff was the seat of consciousness. For the Indians and Hebrews, the heart. In both cases, thinking is emotional, bound up with affects and passions. The dissolution of emotional components is not yet complete. See Part 2. Only if a thought is a passion that grips the heart can it reach ego consciousness and be perceived. Consciousness is only affected by the proximity of the idea to the archetype. But the heart is also the seat of ethical decision. It symbolizes the center of personality. And in the Egyptian judgment of the dead, it is weighed. The heart plays the same role in Jewish mysticism, and even today we speak of a man having a good heart, as though it were an ethical organ. Anything situated lower than the heart belongs to the realm of the instinct. The liver and the kidneys are visceral centers of great importance for psychic life. God trieth the heart and reins, of the man whose conscious and unconscious are to be searched. The examination of the liver as the divinatory center in haruspicy is as well known as the fate of Prometheus, who, for the theft of fire and the hybristic overextension of his consciousness, was punished with the agbit of Inwit by Zeus, who sent an eagle to feed upon his liver. But all visceral centers, which also function as effective centers controlling sexuality, are already centers of higher order. Deeper down lies the psychic plane of the intestinal processes of the alimentary tract. The instinct to eat, hunger, is one of the most elementary of man's psychic instincts. And the psychology of the belly plays a correspondingly large role with primitives and children. One's state of mind is the more dependent upon whether one is satisfied or not, or thirsty or not, the less one's conscious and one's ego are developed. For the embryonic ego, the nutritional side is the only important factor, and this sphere is still very strongly accentuated in the infantile ego, which regards the maternal Uroboros as the source of food and satisfaction. The Uroboros is properly called the tail eater, and the symbol of the alimentary canal dominates this whole stage. The swamp stage of the Uroboros in early matriarchate, as described by Bashofen, is a world in which every creature devours every other. Cannibalism is symptomatic of the state of affairs. On this level, which is pregenital because sex is yet not operative, and the polar tension of the sexes is still in abeyance, there is only a stronger that eats, and a weaker that is eaten. In this animal world, since writing is relatively rare, the visceral psychology of hunger occupies the foreground. Hunger and food are the prime movers of mankind. Everywhere we find in the initial creation myths a pregenital food symbolism, transpersonal because sprung from the original collective layer of symbols. The systole and distole of human existence center on the functions of the digestive tract. Eating equals intake, birth equals output, food the only content, being nourished the fundamental form of vegetative animal existence. That is the motto. Life equals power equals food. The earliest formula for obtaining power over anything appears in the oldest of the pyramid texts. They say of the risen dead, quote, "The sky clouds over, the stars rain down, the mountains stir themselves, the cattle of the earth god tremble at the sight of him, as he appears before them with the living soul of a god who lives upon his fathers and devours his mothers. It is he who devours men and lives upon the gods, the catcher of skulls. He catches them for him. He of the resplendent head watches them for him. He drives them to him. The great ones are for his breakfast, their lesser ones for his dinner, and their little ones for his supper. Whomsoever he meets on his way he eats raw. He has taken away the hearts of the gods. He has eaten the red crown and swallowed the green crown. He eats the lungs of wise men. He is content to live upon hearts and their magic. He rejoices if he can devour those who are in the red crown. He flourishes and their magic is in his body, and his glory is not taken from him. He has devoured the understanding of all the gods." We find a corresponding symbolism in India. In one account of the creation, the first divinities fall headlong into the sea, and hunger and thirst are delivered upon the negative powers of the primeval waters. The account continues, quote, "Hunger and thirst said to him, the Self, 'For us to also find an abode.' To them he said, 'I assign you to part among these divinities. I make you two partakers among them. Therefore to whatever divinity an oblation is made, hunger and thirst become partakers in it.' He bethought himself, 'Here now are worlds and world guardians. Let me create food for them.' He brooded upon waters, and out of them that were brooded upon there arose a form. The form that arose is food." Unquote. Food becomes a cosmic content to be seized hold of, and when the Self finally manages to seize hold of it with apana, the digestive breath, he consumed it. In another passage, hunger is symbolized as death. He is the eater and the devourer, as we know from the deadly and devouring aspect of the Uroboros. Even today, language cannot get away from these elementary images. Eating, devouring, hunger, death, and Mog go together. And we still speak, just like the primitives, of death's maw, a devouring war, a consuming disease. Being swallowed and eaten is an archetype that occurs not only in the medieval paintings of hell and the devil. We ourselves express the swallowing of something small by something big in the same imagery, When we say that a man is consumed by his work, by a movement or an idea, or eaten up with jealousy. On this level, where the Uroboros is co-oriented with cosmogony, the world or cosmic content to be assimilated is food. Food is a phase of Brahma. Quote, "From food all creatures are produced, all creatures that dwell on earth. By food they live, and into food they finally pass. Food is chief among beings, therefore they call it a panacea. Verily he obtains all food, who worships Brahma as food. For food is chief among beings, therefore they call it a panacea. All creatures are born food. By food they continue to grow. Creatures feed on it upon creatures. Therefore it is called food. Brahma arises through tapas. From Brahma comes food. From food, breath, spirit, truth, worlds, and in works, immortality." Unquote. The same symbolism is used in the Maitreya Upanishad, where the relation between the world and God is equivalent to that between food and the eater of food. God, once glorified as the world nourisher, is now seen as the world devourer, for the world is God's sacrificial food. Just as in primitive psychology and mythology, the elementary Uroboros is a cosmic quantity, so its symbolism also appears in the relatively late philosophical speculations of India, for the purpose of clarifying the relations between God as subject and world as object, and vice versa. In this connection, we must mention the sacrifice that is offered to the god in the form of food and eaten by him. It is at once an act of incorporation or inward digestion, and of seizure for increase of power. So the world in India is the food of the gods. As Doisen has explained, the world, according to an early Vedic idea, was created by Prajapati, who is at once life and death, or hunger. It was created in order to be eaten as the sacrifice which he himself offers to himself. This is how the horse sacrifice is interpreted, the horse standing for the universe, like the bull in other cultures. Quote, "Whatever he brought forth, he resolved to eat. Because he eats everything, he is called infinite, Aditi. Therefore he knows the essence of Aditi, becomes the eater of the world. Everything becomes food for him." Unquote. From this it is clear that at a later age, correctly interpreting the old symbolism has spiritualized it, or inwardly digested it. For the act of eating, digesting, and assimilating the world now appears as a means to possess and obtain power over it. To know the essence of Aditi is to experience the infinite being of the Creator who eats the world that he has created. Thus, on a primitive level, conscious realization is called eating. When we talk of the conscious mind as assimilating an unconscious content, we are not saying much more than is implied in the symbol of eating and digesting. The examples from Indian and Egyptian mythology could be multiplied at will, for this sort of elementary food symbolism is archetypal. Wherever liquor, fruit, herbs, etc., appear as the vehicles of life and immortality, including water and bread of life, the sacrament of the host, and every form of food cult down to the present day, we have this ancient mode of human experience before us, the materialization of psychic contents, by which the contents we would call psychic, like life, immortality, and death, take on material form in myth and ritual, and appear as water, bread, fruit, etc., is a characteristic of the primitive mind. Inside is projected outside, as we say. In reality, there's a psychization of the object. Everything outside is experienced symbolically, as though saturated with the content that we coordinate with the psyche as something psychic or spiritual. This material object outside is then assimilated, i.e., eaten. Conscious realization is acted out in the elementary scheme of nutritive assimilation, and the ritual act of concrete eating is the first form of assimilation known to man. Over this whole sphere of symbolism looms the maternal Uroboros in its mother-child aspect, where need is hunger and satisfaction means satiety. The body in its autoerotic narcissistic sense of self, we shall be reviewing this idea later on, is an Urboric closed circuit. In this pregenital stage, Self-gratification is not masturbation, but the satisfaction of being nourished, with the infant's finger sucking as a substitute. To obtain is to eat. It does not mean to be fertilized. To produce, to express, means to excrete, spit, urinate, later to speak, but not to give birth or beget. The masturbatory stage of the Uroboric creation is, on the other hand, genital in character, which precedes the sexual stage of the world parents, which is the stage of propagation and duality, and both are preceded by the stage of the alimentary Uroboros. All the above bodily functions symbolize something that is at the same time a psychic process. The rites of cannibalism in the funeral feast, the eating of gods in the pyramid texts, and the communion mysteries represent a spiritual act. The assimilation and ingestion of the content, the eaten food, produces an inner change. Transformation of body cells through food intake is the most elementary of animal changes experienced by man. How a weary, enfeebled, and famished man can turn into an alert, strong, and satisfied being, or a man perishing of thirst can be refreshed or even transformed by an intoxicating drink. This is and must remain a fundamental experience so long as man shall exist. The emergence of corresponding symbolism does not mean regression to the oral zone, in the sense that this is an infantile perverse zone of sexual pleasure which we ought to overcome, but is simply a return to the Uroboric symbolism, positively accented by the unconscious. Being fertilized by eating does not imply ignorance of the sexual act, nor is it in any sense an unenlightened substitute. It means total assimilation rather than union with. It is something different than the above-mentioned fertilization by the wind. In eating, the accent falls on the bodily intake, but in the latter case, on the invisibility of the animating and fertilizing agent. Accordingly, at the stage of the maternal alimentary Uroboros, the breasts are always emphasized, as for instance in the mythological pictures of the many-breasted Great Mother, or the innumerable statues of the goddess who presses her breasts. Here the nourishing Great Mother is more generative than parturient. Breasts and lactic floor are generative elements which can also appear in phallic form, because the milk is understood symbolically as a fertilizing agent. The milk-giving mother, whose commonmost symbol is the cow, is procreative and on that account may even have a paternal character. Her child, as something she fertilizes, is then receptive and feminine, regardless of its sex. The maternal Uroboros is still hermaphroditic and pre-sexual, like the child, so the mother propagates by nourishing, just as the child is fertilized by eating and gives birth by evacuating. For both of them, the nutrient flow is a symbol of life without polar tension, and entirely unsexual. The accentuation of the mother's breasts and its phallic character, however, already forms the transition stage. The original situation is one of complete contentment in the Uroboros. When the phallic character of the breast emerges, or the mother is seen as a phallus bearer, it is a sign that the infantile subject is beginning to differentiate himself. Active and passive strivings gradually become distinct. The opposites make their appearance. Conceiving by eating and giving birth by excreting are differentiated as separate acts within the nutrient flow, and the ego begins to distinguish itself from the Uroboros. This means the end of that beatific Uroboric state of autarky, perfection, and absolute self-sufficiency. So long as the ego is swimming in the belly of the Uroboros, a mere ego germ, it shared in that paradisal perfection. This autarky holds absolute sway in the womb, where unconscious existence is combined with absence of suffering. Everything is supplied of its own accord. There is no need of the slightest exertion, not even an instinctive reaction, let alone regulating ego consciousness. One's own being in the surrounding world, in this case the mother's body, exists in the participation mystique, never more to be attained in any environmental relationship. This state of egolessness, interrupted by no pleasure-pain reactions, is naturally experienced by the later ego consciousness as one of the most perfect forms of autarky, bringing utter contentment. Plato describes the formation of the world in words that recall this contentment within the Uroboros. Quote, "It had no need of eyes, for there was nothing outside it to be seen, nor of ears, for there was nothing outside it to be heard. There was no surrounding air to be breathed, nor was it in need of any orgar by which to supply itself with food, or to get rid of it when digested. Nothing went out or came into it anywhere, for there was nothing. Of design it was made thus, its own waste providing its own food, acting and being acted upon entirely within and by itself, because its designer considered that a being which was sufficient unto itself would be far more excellent than one which depended upon anything." Unquote. Once more we met the Urboric cycle of self-propagation on the elementary level. Just as the Uroboros fertilizes itself in the mouth by eating its own tail, so its own waste provides its own food, an ever-recurrent symbol of autonomy and self-sufficiency. This primordial image of the autarkic Uroboros underlines the homunculus of alchemy, who's begotten in the round, the retort, by the rotation of these elements, and even underlies the perpetuum mobile of physics. We shall have to concern ourselves with the problem of autarky at all stages of our inquiry, because it is bound up with an important trend in man's development, namely with the problem of his self-formation. So far we have distinguished 3 stages of Urboric autarky. The first is the pleromatic stage of paradisal perfection in the unborn, the embryonic stage of the ego, which a later consciousness will contrast with the sufferings of the non-autarkic ego in the world. The second stage is that of the elementary Uroboros, a closed circuit whose own waste provides its own food. The third, genital masturbatory phase is that of Atum, copulating in his own hand. All these images, like the self-incubation of one made pregnant through tapas, a later spiritual form of autarky, are images of the self-contained creative principle. Uroboric autarky, even when it appears as a dominant archetype, must not be reduced to the level of autoeroticism and narcissism. Both of these conceptions are only valid in the cases of misdevelopment, when the evolutionary stage ruled by the Uroboros persists for an unnaturally long time. But even then the positive aspect must be borne in mind. Autarky is just as necessary a goal of life and development as is adaptation. Self-development, self-differentiation, and self-formation are trends of the libido no less legitimate than the extroverted relation to the object and the introverted relation to the subject. The negative evaluation implied by the terms autoeroticism, autism, and narcissism is only justified in pathological cases where there are deviations from this natural basic attitude. For the development of the ego, of consciousness, of personality, and lastly, of the individuality itself, is actually fostered by the autarky whose symbol is the Uroboros. In many cases, therefore, the appearance of Urboric symbolism, especially if it is formative and stabilizing character is strongly marked, as for instance in the mandala, indicates that the ego is moving forward towards the self, rather than in the direction of objective adaptation. Detachment from the Uroboros, entry into the world, and the encounter with the universal principle of opposites are essential tasks of human and individual development. The process of coming to terms with the objects of outer and inner worlds, of adapting to the collective life of mankind both within and without, governs with varying degrees of intensity the life of every individual. For the extrovert, the accent lies on the objects outside, people, things, and circumstances. For the introvert, it lies on the objects inside, the complexes and archetypes. Even the introvert's development, which relates mainly to the psychic background, is in this sense bound to the object, despite the fact that the objects lie inside him and not outside, being psychic forces rather than social, economic, or physical ones. But besides this trend of development, there is another, equally legitimate, which is self-related or centroverted, and which makes for the development of personality and for individual realization. This development may derive its contents from outside and inside equally, and it's fed by introversion as much by extroversion. Its center of gravity, however, lies not in objects, but objective dealings, irrespective of whether the objects be external or internal. but in self-formation. That is to say, in the building up and filling out of a personality which, as the nucleus of all life's activities, uses the objects of the inner and outer worlds as building material for its own wholeness. This wholeness is an end of itself, autarkic. It is quite independent of any utility value it may have either for the collective outside or for the psychic powers inside. That we are nevertheless concerned here with a creative principle of decisive importance for civilization will be shown in its proper place. Self-formation, whose effects in the second half of life Jung has termed individuation, has its critical development pattern not only in the first half of life, but also back in childhood. The growth of consciousness and of the ego is largely governed by this pattern. The stability of the ego, i.e., its ability to stand firm against the disintegrative tendencies of the unconscious and the world, is developed very early, and is also the trend towards extension of consciousness, which is likewise an important prerequisite for self-formation. Although in the first half of life, ego and consciousness are mainly preoccupied with adaptation, and the self-formative trend seems to be in abeyance. Yet the beginnings of the self-realization process, while it only becomes noticeable with increasing maturity, lie far back in childhood, and it is here that the first struggles for self-formation are decided. The allegedly narcissistic, autistic, autoerotic, egocentric, and as we saw, anthropocentric stage of the Uroboros, so obvious in the child's autarkic and naive self-relatedness, is the precondition of all subsequent self-development. The same Urboric symbolism that stands at the beginning, before ego development starts, reappears at the end, when ego development is replaced by the development of the self, or individuation. When the universal principle of opposites no longer predominates, and devouring or being devoured by the world has ceased to be of prime importance, the Uroboros symbol will reappear as the mandala in the psychology of the adult. The goal of life now is to make oneself independent of the world, to detach oneself from it and stand by oneself. The autarkic character of the Uroboros appears as a positive symbol pointing in a new direction. Whereas the Urboric Incest of the neurotic and his pleromatic fixation denote an inability to break away from his origins, and a refusal to be born into the world, the appearance of the mandala in the Uroboros symbolism in the mature man is an indication that he must once more free himself from this world, for he is now fed up with it and come to himself. He has, by a new process, to bear himself out in this world, just as he had to bear himself into it with his nascent ego. Hence the perfect figure of the Uroboros, standing as it does at the center of the unconscious world of the primitive and child, is simultaneously the central symbol of the second half of life, and the nucleus of the development trend we have called self-formation, or centroversion. The symbol of the circular mandala stands at the beginning as at the end. In the beginning it takes the mythological form of paradise, and in the end, of heavenly Jerusalem. The perfect figure of the circle, from whose center radiate the forearms of a cross, in which the opposites are at rest, is a very early and very late symbol historically. It is found in the sanctuaries of the Stone Age. It is the paradise where the four streams have their source, and in Canaanite mythology it is the central point where the great god El sits, quote, at the source of the streams, in the midst of the source of the two seas, unquote. The Uroboros, traceable in all epochs and cultures, then appears as the latest symbol of the individual's psychic development, signifying the roundness of the psyche, life's wholeness, and perfection regained. It is the place of transfiguration and illumination, of finality, as well as the place of mythological origination. Thus the great round of the Uroboros arches over man's life, encompassing his earliest childhood and receiving him again, in altered form at the end. But in his own individual life too, the pleroma of universal unity can be sought and found in religious experience. In mysticism, where the self-reentrant figure of the Uroboros appears as the ocean of Godhead, there is often a dissolution of the ego, an ecstatic surrender which is equivalent to Auroboric Incest. But when instead of the death ecstasy of the ego, the Sterbe und Weder principle of rebirth predominates, and the theme of rebirth prevails over that of death, this is not a regression, but a creative process. Its relation to the Uroboric stage will finally be discussed elsewhere. For the distinction between creative and pathological processes is of utmost importance in all depth psychology. For both processes, the Uroboros is appropriate as a symbol of origination. In creative phenomena too, and not only religious phenomena, the life-spanning figure of the round signifies the regenerative sea and the source of higher life. It is, however, the same figure whose clinging embrace prevents the neurotic from becoming born into life. Then it is no longer the primordial figure of the Uroboros, but in the case of a more developed ego, the indication that a further stage has been reached, namely, the dominance of the Uroboros over the ego, or the stage of the Great Mother.